The morning of November 11th, 1918, began like every other day at the front, cold, grey, and cruelly quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but the deep breath before something terrible. Private Samuel Clark had seen too many dawns like this. He was 24, though the mirror of the trench puddle told him otherwise. His hair had begun to grey, his eyes hollowed out like the craters in no man's land. Mud clung to his boots like a curse. The stench of cordite, rot, and unwashed bodies hung in the air. The men didn't speak much anymore. Words felt wasted when you could be gone in a second. The only sound was the occasional crack of a distant rifle, a reminder that even as the world whispered of armistice, death hadn't gotten the message yet. Rumors had spread through the line that morning. "It's over," some said. "The Germans are done." The papers said so. Others just stared, unwilling to hope. Samuel didn't believe in rumors. Not after the Somme. Not after Passchendaele. He'd learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing in the trenches. It got men killed faster than bullets. He fingered the crumpled letter in his pocket. It was from his sister, written weeks ago, saying how proud the family was of him, how they were praying every day for his safe return. He'd read it so many times the paper had started to dissolve in his hands, like the memory of home itself. At 10:45 a.m., his commanding officer walked down the line. "Listen up, boys," he said, voice hoarse. "We've received word. The Germans have signed the armistice. The ceasefire goes into effect at 1100 hours. That's 15 minutes from now." The trench fell silent. 15 minutes. 15 minutes until the war was over. Samuel's heart stuttered. He felt something he hadn't in years, something close to disbelief. Could it really end? Just like that? For years of slaughter, ending because some men in clean uniforms signed a piece of paper? But the guns didn't stop. Not yet. The machine gun still rattled in the distance, the artillery still roared. Somewhere, someone hadn't gotten the message, or refused to stop shooting. Samuel crouched in the trench, glancing up at the grey sky. 15 minutes, he whispered. Just 15 minutes more. When you live every day on the edge of death, 15 minutes feels like a lifetime. The shelling didn't ease up. In fact, it grew worse. The Germans must have been firing off what they had left, unleashing their final storm before the silence. Mortar rounds screamed overhead, bursting in geysers of mud and flame. Samuel's hands shook as he pressed himself against the trench wall, mud dripping down his helmet. "Bloody hell," muttered Thomas Briggs, the kid from Manchester beside him. "They can't even let us end it quiet, can they?" Samuel didn't answer. His heart was hammering, but it wasn't fear this time, it was fury. Fury that, after everything, the last sound he might hear wouldn't be peace, but another shell. Another blast shook the trench, showering them with debris. Thomas screamed, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. Samuel pulled him close, instinct taking over. He'd patched up too many men to hesitate now. "Hold still," Samuel said, ripping his sleeve to make a bandage. "It's almost over." "You hear me?" "Almost over." Thomas nodded weakly. "They said 11 sharp, yeah." "Yeah," Samuel muttered. 11 sharp. At 10:59, the gun still thundered. The world trembled around them. Samuel clenched his fists. "One more minute," he whispered. "One more." And then, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. Not faded, not slowed. Stopped. The sound of it, the absence of sound, hit harder than any explosion. The entire front seemed to exhale at once. Men looked at each other like ghosts. Birds began to sing, tentatively, as if testing whether it was real. Somewhere down the line, a soldier laughed, a strange, wild laugh that broke into sobs. Samuel sank to his knees, staring into the still air. The silence rang in his ears. It didn't feel like victory. It felt impossible. Too sudden. Too fragile. Like one wrong breath might shatter it. Thomas looked up at him, pale but smiling weakly. "We made it, Sam," he whispered. "We bloody made it." Samuel nodded, but inside, something heavy twisted. He looked at the lifeless expanse of no man's land, at the thousands who would never hear this silence. He thought of the faces he'd buried, the friends who'd faded into the mud. The war was over, but what of those who had carried it home inside them? That night, the soldiers lit small fires and sang songs they'd forgotten the words to. Laughter mingled with tears. Some of the men didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. It was as if the soul of the world had stopped bleeding, but the wound was still open. Samuel sat alone by a dying fire, Thomas asleep beside him. The stars were out, clear, cold, and indifferent. He took out his sister's letter again, but his hands trembled too much to unfold it. He thought of home. Of the farm he hadn't seen since 1914. Of the girl he'd promised to write to but hadn't. He thought of all the mornings he'd woken expecting to die, and now, for the first time, he didn't have to. And yet, he felt hollow. The silence that everyone longed for felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The guns were gone, but their echo still lived in his mind. Every sudden noise made him flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like incoming fire. Peace, he realized, was going to take longer to learn than war ever had. As dawn broke over the ruined land, Samuel stood. The air smelled of smoke and frost. He looked out at the horizon, the line that had divided men for 4 years, and whispered to no one, "You can stop the guns, but not the echoes." He turned toward the west, toward home. But with every step, he knew that part of him would never leave the trenches. The war was over. But for Samuel Clark, the man who heard the guns fall silent, it had only just begun. Samuel Clark returned home in the spring of 1919, though the word home felt foreign now. The train ride back through England was quiet, lined with men in tattered uniforms and empty eyes. The villages along the way were decorated with flags and flowers, women waving, children running alongside the train shouting, "The heroes are home." But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. None of them did. He stepped off at a small countryside station just before dusk. The air was clean, too clean, and smelled of rain and grass, not mud and smoke. His mother stood on the platform, older than he remembered, her hands trembling as she pressed them over her mouth. When she finally reached him, she didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around him and wept into his shoulder. "Thank God," she whispered through tears. "Thank God you're home." Samuel didn't know how to answer. He hugged her back, but he felt detached, as though he were watching himself from a distance. He wanted to cry too, to feel that same rush of relief, but there was nothing. Just silence. The same endless, suffocating silence that had followed him from the front. Life after the war was meant to be simple. Samuel tried to make it so. He returned to the farm, to the quiet fields where nothing ever seemed to change. The cows still grazed, the wind still carried the scent of soil, and the river still glimmered in the afternoon sun. But Samuel had changed. Every morning, when he walked through the barn, he saw flashes, men shouting, explosions blooming like thunderclouds, the faces of friends who'd fallen beside him. When he closed his eyes, the silence turned into ringing, the same sharp whine of artillery fading away. He couldn't bear the sound of hammers or the pop of the tractor's engine. They all sounded like shells. Nights were the worst, dreams full of mud, screams, and the relentless beating of rain on tin helmets. He'd wake soaked in sweat, clutching at his chest, expecting to see the trench walls closing in. His mother noticed, of course. "You're safe now, Sam," she'd tell him softly, brushing his hair back. "It's all over." But he couldn't say what he really felt, that the war hadn't ended at 11 o'clock that morning. It had simply followed him home. One evening, while tending the fence near the edge of the property, Samuel heard the church bells from the village. The sound froze him where he stood. For a moment, it wasn't bells, it was the echo of gunfire. He dropped the hammer, his breath catching in his throat. When he blinked, he saw it, the field ahead of him transformed. No longer green, but grey. Torn apart. The fence posts became splintered trees, the soil turned to mud. He could almost smell the gas again, hear the shouting. His heart pounded as if it were trying to escape his chest. Then, in the distance, he saw something that made him fall to his knees, Thomas Briggs, standing there in uniform, smiling that crooked grin of his. Samuel blinked again, and the field was empty. He stayed there for a long while, hands trembling, breath uneven. He wasn't losing his mind, not entirely. He knew it was the war, still clawing at him. The ghosts weren't gone. They never would be. That night, he sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. In the trench, they had joked that the fire was the only thing that made them feel human. Now, it just reminded him of everything he'd lost. The following Sunday, Samuel went into the village for the first time in months. The streets were filled with laughter, children running between market stalls, and men sharing pints as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. At the center of the square stood a new monument, white marble, polished and perfect. "To our fallen sons, 1914 to 1918. He stared at it for a long time. The names carved into it glimmered faintly in the sun. His fingers brushed the stone, tracing the letters he knew too well. Thomas Briggs. Henry Foster. James Wright. Each one hit him like a bullet. A priest standing nearby noticed him. "You served with them?" the man asked. Samuel nodded. "They'd be proud of you," the priest said gently. But Samuel only shook his head. They shouldn't have had to die to make anyone proud. He turned and walked away before the priest could answer. The laughter and chatter of the crowd faded behind him, and for the first time in months, he let himself cry. Not for the war, but for the silence that followed it. In the years that followed, Samuel found his own quiet way of healing. He began writing letters, not to anyone, but for those who couldn't write their own. Letters to the dead. Letters to the forgotten. He'd sit by the river, pen in hand, and whisper aloud as he wrote. "Thomas, it's spring again. The cows are fat, the wheat is high. Your sister's little one's walking now. You'd like him, I think." Sometimes he'd burn the letters. Sometimes he'd tuck them into the soil near the old fence. But every word helped loosen the weight on his chest. He never told anyone why he did it. It was his own way of remembering, his own way of keeping the silence from swallowing him whole. On the 11th of November, 1928, 10 years after the armistice, the village held a memorial service. Bells rang across the fields, echoing through the valleys. People gathered, some with medals pinned to their coats, others with tears in their eyes. Samuel stood apart from the crowd, hands in his pockets, hat low. He didn't like ceremonies. Too clean. Too polished. But when the last bell struck 11, he closed his eyes. The same sound that had once signaled the end of hell now rolled across the hills like a benediction. And for the first time, he didn't hear gunfire in it. He only heard peace. He smiled faintly, tears catching in the corners of his eyes. "You can rest now," he whispered, voice trembling. "All of you." Then he turned toward the open fields, the wind rustling the tall grass, and began walking home.